Today, we're diving into the most brutal revenge deaths ever recorded, from calculated acts of workplace sabotage that turned fatal in remote locations to jealousy-fueled confrontations at dangerous cliff edges where one final push sealed a victim's fate forever. It was July 19, 2018, at a public lake in Madison, Wisconsin during a hot summer afternoon. The shoreline was crowded with weekend visitors. Near the dock, the water appeared calm and shallow, but algae, shadows, and uneven depth created sudden drop-offs where boats tied up. Alyssa Morgan was 32 years old. She worked as a marketing coordinator for a regional retail chain and had moved to Madison a few years earlier. Friends described her as social and careful. She could not swim. She avoided swimming entirely and stayed only where she believed her feet could touch the bottom. The people with her knew this. That afternoon, Alyssa stayed close to the dock, sitting in a large inner tube with her arms resting on the sides. From the dock, friends talked with her while their legs hung in the water. Several people recorded short phone clips, nothing staged or planned. Earlier that week, a friend had bought a novelty inflatable shaped like a shark fin. It was small, black, and rigid enough to stay upright in the water. Someone suggested using it to scare Alyssa as a joke. There was no detailed planning. The assumption was that she would react, realize it was fake, and laugh. One person slipped quietly into the water behind her, keeping low and out of view. Alyssa was facing the dock, focused on the people above her, and did not notice the movement behind her. The inflatable fin was held just beneath the surface, then eased forward so it broke the water slowly, angled toward her legs in a way that suggested motion. When Alyssa noticed the shape, she reacted immediately. She did not pause to assess what she was seeing. The sudden appearance triggered fear, and her response was instinctive rather than planned. Instead of swimming away, Alyssa tried to pull herself up onto the inner tube. Her arms pressed down unevenly on the sides. The tube rolled under her shifting weight. She lost balance and slid off the side, reaching toward the dock as she fell. Her hand missed the edge. As she dropped, her head struck the rigid wooden underside of the dock. The impact was direct and forceful. She lost consciousness immediately. Her body fell face down into the water beside the dock, partly under the structure where the light was limited and visibility was poor. For several seconds, it was unclear what had happened. Then it became apparent she was not moving or resurfacing. People nearby entered the water and pulled her out from beside the dock and up onto the planks. When Alyssa was removed from the lake, she was unresponsive. CPR was started on the dock. Emergency services arrived and continued treatment, but she never regained consciousness. She was pronounced dead later that day. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death as blunt head trauma followed by drowning. The head injury caused immediate loss of consciousness. Water found deep in the lungs confirmed she inhaled water after submersion. Investigators reviewed phone footage, which showed the inflatable fin approaching and Alyssa's sudden panic. The prank was identified as the trigger. No criminal charges were filed. Authorities classified the death as an accidental drowning resulting from a prank. The inflatable was documented and referenced in the investigative report, and the footage was included in the official report. Friends later stated the hardest part to accept was how little time it took. The water appeared safe. Help was nearby. The panic lasted only seconds. Alyssa never knew the threat was not real. In Phoenix, a fake beauty treatment became a death trap. But across the country in Detroit, family bonds would prove just as fragile when a cousin's idea of fun turned into something far more sinister. It was March 18, 2017. Evening temperatures in Detroit, Michigan dropped to 34 degrees under overcast skies. At an abandoned warehouse on the city's east side, the concrete interior had chilled to approximately 28 degrees. Jennifer Walsh, a 22-year-old single mother, was working the night shift at a 24-hour gas station. She had been doing this job for 8 months to support her daughter, Lily. Jennifer was quiet and kept to herself. She had no car and took 2 buses to get to work each night. That Saturday evening, Jennifer's cousin Kyle Walsh showed up at the gas station with 2 of his friends, Trevor and Devin. Kyle was 24 and worked construction when he could find jobs. He had always thought Jennifer was too trusting and easy to fool. Kyle had been unemployed for 3 weeks and was facing eviction from his apartment. The week before, he had asked Jennifer for a loan. but she refused, saying she could barely afford her own expenses. Kyle described the idea as a viral trust fall challenge meant for social media, claiming it would attract attention and views. Jennifer had little experience with online trends, and Kyle framed the video as a way for her to be noticed. The plan involved Jennifer standing on a platform roughly 12 feet high and falling backward, trusting Kyle and his friends to break the fall with mattresses placed below. Jennifer was hesitant and uncomfortable with heights, and the setup sounded risky. Kyle continued to pressure her, presenting the challenge as harmless and popular, with Trevor and Devin reinforcing that similar videos routinely gained traction online. After her shift ended at 11 p.m., Jennifer agreed to participate. The three men drove her about 15 minutes to an abandoned warehouse on the city's east side. Inside, Kyle showed her an old loading dock platform used years earlier for trucks, with several worn mattresses and cushions arranged on the concrete floor below, assuring her the setup was safe. Kyle positioned Trevor and Devin with their phones to film from different angles. He said they needed multiple camera views to make the video more dramatic. Jennifer climbed up onto the platform using a rusty metal ladder. The warehouse was filled with construction debris and broken glass scattered across the concrete floor. Jennifer could see that the mattresses below were visibly moldy and torn. The setup looked inadequate for such a height, but Kyle assured her it would be fine. Kyle told Jennifer to stand at the edge of the platform with her back to the drop. He said she needed to fall straight back and trust that they would catch her. As Jennifer prepared to fall, Kyle adjusted the placement of the mattresses to reposition the camera framing, reducing the padding beneath part of the drop zone. Jennifer fell backward as instructed, missed part of the padding below, and struck the concrete floor head first while her legs landed on the edge of one mattress. Jennifer lost consciousness immediately upon impact. Kyle, Trevor, and Devin rushed over, but Jennifer was unresponsive with visible head trauma. Trevor called 911 while Kyle attempted to reposition the mattresses. Paramedics arrived within 8 minutes and found Jennifer unresponsive with severe head trauma. She was pronounced dead at the scene from severe traumatic brain injury caused by the 12-foot fall onto concrete. Police recovered video footage from all three phones showing Kyle adjusting the safety equipment shortly before Jennifer's fall. Kyle Walsh was charged with involuntary manslaughter and sentenced to 12 years in prison. It was October 31st, 2017, in a college dormitory kitchen in Portland, Oregon. Halloween night had brought temperatures down to 45 degrees, and students throughout the building were preparing for costume parties and celebrations. Liam Gupta was 28 years old and working as a graduate student in chemistry while serving as a teaching assistant to pay for his studies. He was brilliant academically, but struggled with social situations and had never learned to read social cues properly. Liam lived alone in graduate housing and spent most of his time either in the laboratory or studying in his small apartment. He had never been invited to parties or social events during his years in college. He worked in the campus chemistry lab, which gave him access to various laboratory equipment and chemicals, including liquid nitrogen used for research experiments. Liam was known among the undergraduate students for being extremely knowledgeable about chemistry, but also for being awkward and eager to fit in with the younger crowd. The isolation had been particularly difficult for Liam during his graduate studies, as he watched other students form friendships while he remained focused solely on his research. That Halloween evening, 18-year-old Stephen Patel approached Liam about participating in a party video. Stephen was a popular undergraduate freshman who ran a social media account focused on viral challenges and stunts. He had been looking for new content that would attract views and had heard about Liam's access to laboratory materials. Stephen told Liam about a trending social media challenge where people created instant ice cream using liquid nitrogen. Stephen's account was competing with other freshmen for campus popularity, and he needed something dramatic to stand out. He had noticed Liam's eagerness to be included in social activities and saw an opportunity to exploit that desperation. Stephen had researched liquid nitrogen experiments online and thought he understood the safety requirements, though his knowledge was superficial and incomplete. Stephen convinced Liam to bring a small dewar flask of liquid nitrogen from the lab for a demonstration, assuring him it would be safe and that they would only use it for the ice cream video. The plan was to show how liquid nitrogen could instantly freeze cream and flavorings to create ice cream in seconds. Stephen set up his camera equipment in the dormitory kitchen while Liam prepared the liquid nitrogen in a metal container. As the video progressed, Stephen encouraged Liam to make the demonstration more dramatic and visually impressive. He suggested that Liam try the dragon breath effect, where a person briefly holds a small amount of liquid nitrogen in their mouth and exhales vapor, a stunt that had circulated online despite repeated safety warnings about its dangers. Liam was hesitant because he understood the extreme dangers of liquid nitrogen, an extremely cold cryogenic substance, but Stephen and several party guests pressured him, insisting it would be safe if done quickly. Liam reluctantly agreed and attempted to demonstrate the stunt using a small amount of liquid nitrogen. During the process, some of the liquid was accidentally swallowed. Inside his stomach, the liquid nitrogen rapidly expanded into gas, causing severe internal pressure and tearing. Liam doubled over in pain, dropped the container, and collapsed to the kitchen floor as he went into medical shock. Several party guests witnessed his collapse and called 911. Emergency medical services arrived within minutes and transported Liam to the hospital. Despite emergency intervention, his condition deteriorated rapidly due to internal injuries. He was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The coroner determined that Liam died from internal injuries caused by rapid gas expansion following the ingestion of liquid nitrogen, leading to catastrophic internal trauma and shock. Stephen initially claimed that Liam had volunteered to try the stunt on his own, but video evidence and witness statements showed Stephen encouraging and pressuring Liam throughout the incident. The university conducted an internal investigation and found that Stephen had violated campus safety policies by encouraging the misuse of hazardous materials. Stephen was expelled from the university and charged with criminal negligence. The case was closed after Stephen accepted a plea deal for reckless endangerment and received probation and community service. The chemistry department implemented stricter controls on laboratory chemical access and mandatory safety training for all students. Liam's tragedy showed how a moment of peer pressure and misplaced trust in a controlled environment could turn deadly. It was July 22, 2016, at a residential complex in Tampa, Florida, where evening humidity hung thick and temperatures remained in the mid-80s despite the late hour. The facility featured a large community pool with a retractable fiberglass cover system. The pool had been partially drained for maintenance, exposing several feet of concrete walls above the waterline. Harlan West, a 34-year-old night maintenance worker, was completing his final rounds before scheduled repairs. He was known for his professionalism in ensuring recreational facilities remained safe and functional. Noah Briggs, a 29-year-old resident of the complex, had been involved in an escalating dispute with West over noise complaints. West lived in an adjacent unit and had filed multiple complaints with the Homeowners Association about late-night gatherings at Briggs's apartment that violated community quiet hours. These complaints had resulted in fines totaling over $1,500 for Briggs and a formal warning that further violations could result in lease termination. Text messages recovered later from Briggs's phone contained hostile references to West and statements about teaching him a lesson for ruining his life over nothing. Briggs had become increasingly agitated about the financial burden of the fines and what he perceived as West's excessive interference in his personal activities. The pool cover system consisted of motorized tracks and a large fiberglass panel that could be extended across the water surface. That evening, West was conducting his standard closing inspection of the pool area. A resident operating a recreational drone captured footage during West's inspection, recording him walking along the pool's edge, examining the cover mechanism. Briggs had accessed the pool equipment area earlier that day and loosened several critical anchor bolts beneath the fiberglass cover. These bolts were essential structural components that distributed the cover's weight across the support framework. Briggs later claimed he intended only to create a malfunction that would reflect poorly on West's maintenance work and potentially get him reprimanded by management. As West stepped onto the pool deck adjacent to the cover's track to complete his inspection, the compromised support system experienced progressive anchor bolt failure. The fiberglass panel, carrying a distributed load of several hundred pounds across its support framework, collapsed without warning. West fell 9 feet onto the exposed concrete bottom of the partially drained pool, striking the hard surface with significant force. The collapsing cover material fell on top of him, creating additional impact trauma. The drone footage captured the sudden structural failure and West's fall, though the angle prevented clear visibility of the final impact. Multiple fractures to his skull and spine occurred upon contact with the concrete surface, and movement ceased within seconds of the collapse. The resident operating the drone immediately contacted emergency services after witnessing the accident. Paramedics arrived within 8 minutes, but found West unresponsive beneath the collapsed cover material. He was pronounced dead at the scene from traumatic injuries, consistent with a high-impact fall onto concrete. Investigators examining the pool cover system discovered tool marks on the loosened anchor bolts that matched equipment found in Briggs's apartment. The drone footage provided clear evidence of the structural failure sequence, and engineering analysis confirmed that the cover would not have collapsed without the deliberate tampering. Text message records and witness statements about the ongoing dispute established Briggs's motive. Briggs initially denied involvement, but later admitted to loosening the bolts, claiming he intended only to create a mechanical failure that would embarrass West professionally. Structural engineers determined that loosening the anchor bolts caused uneven load redistribution, resulting in progressive shear failure across the remaining supports, making catastrophic collapse inevitable under normal operating conditions. Briggs was charged with manslaughter under Florida law. Following his conviction, he was sentenced to 12 years in state prison. The case prompted new inspection requirements for pool cover systems and stricter penalties for tampering with shared recreational facilities in residential complexes. It was April 7, 2016, at a warehouse loading dock in Missouri, where a 9-foot-high concrete platform lined with pallets and bay doors created a crowded, hazardous work area. Garrick Wade, a 52-year-old dock supervisor, had worked at the facility for nearly 8 years and was known for his strict adherence to safety protocols and company regulations. His methodical approach to warehouse operations had earned him respect from management, but occasional friction with workers who preferred shortcuts. He took pride in maintaining an accident-free record and was quick to reprimand employees who violated established safety guidelines. That afternoon, Garrick had been conducting his routine inspection when he noticed an unusual arrangement of empty pallets near Bay Door 7. The wooden structures had been stacked in an unstable configuration, leaning precariously against the bay door frame at a steep angle that blocked one of the main walkways. The arrangement violated multiple safety protocols and created a potential hazard for anyone working in the area. Leo Munson, a 47-year-old warehouse worker, had deliberately arranged the pallets earlier that day to disrupt operations and get back at Garrick for a recent safety violation citation. 2 weeks prior, Garrick had written Leo up for operating a forklift without proper safety checks, resulting in a formal reprimand. The citation had cost Leo his perfect attendance bonus and damaged his standing with supervisors. Leo's plan was simple: create a minor obstruction that would slow down operations and force Garrick to spend time reorganizing the workspace. He believed the unstable stack would collapse when disturbed, creating a disruption that would force Garrick to intervene without considering how dangerous the falling pallets could be. He had positioned the pallets during his lunch break, propping them against the door frame in a way that appeared stable but would collapse easily if touched. The forklift-mounted camera system captured what followed. Garrick approached the unstable pallet stack and began examining the arrangement. The wooden structures had been balanced precariously against the bay door frame, with several pallets leaning at a dangerous angle. The stack extended nearly 8 feet high, supported only by friction against the metal frame. As Garrick moved closer to inspect the base, he reached out to brace one of the leaning pallets. The moment he applied pressure, the entire arrangement began to shift and topple forward. The sudden movement caught him off guard, and as he instinctively stepped backward, his foot caught on an uneven section of the concrete surface. Garrick stumbled backward, losing his balance as the stack collapsed toward him. As he fell, the back of his head struck the raised metal edge of the loading dock's built-in tie-down rail with devastating force. The impact caused severe traumatic brain injury. The heavy wooden pallets, each weighing approximately 40 pounds, then cascaded down from nearly 8 feet, striking his chest and torso and pinning him to the ground. Other warehouse workers immediately called for emergency assistance and attempted to remove the pallets, but he had stopped breathing within moments. Emergency personnel arrived within 14 minutes, but Garrick was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner determined that the fatal injury was the severe head trauma from striking the dock rail, while the falling pallets caused additional injuries, but were not the primary cause of death. The investigation revealed that Leo had intentionally arranged the pallets in the unstable configuration, and security footage confirmed his involvement. Investigators determined that while Leo had not intended to cause Garrick's death, his deliberate creation of a safety hazard had directly led to the fatal accident. Leo was subsequently charged with involuntary manslaughter in the first degree. Investigators determined that while he had not intended to kill Garrick, his deliberate creation of a dangerous workplace trap showed reckless disregard for human life and directly caused Garrick's death. The facility temporarily suspended loading dock operations, while safety inspectors conducted a review. Management instituted new policies requiring immediate reporting of unusual pallet arrangements or potential safety hazards to prevent similar incidents. It was November 12, 2015, inside a sheet metal fabrication plant on the south edge of Toledo, Ohio. The morning shift started routinely. Machines cycled, supervisors gathered staff, and a safety demonstration was scheduled to address a labor dispute during regular operations. Ronald Pierce was 44, a production supervisor who rose through the ranks rather than through college. He managed output schedules, enforced quotas, and cultivated fear as efficiency. Co-workers described him as precise, confrontational, and publicly dismissive of complaints. He believed safety guards slowed production and framed injuries as personal failures. His authority came from experience, not trust, reinforced by management bonuses tied to uninterrupted production weeks. He rarely documented warnings and routinely pressured subordinates to improvise around disabled safeguards to meet deadlines during inspection gap periods. Evan Brooks, 33, worked the same presses for 11 years and knew their sounds and limits. He reported repeated near misses to OSHA after a co-worker lost 2 fingers. The report threatened a shutdown. Ronald denied Evan severance and labeled him unreliable. Evan stayed on during his final notice period to train replacements, memorizing circuits, relays, and how neglect hid behind normal operation. He understood hydraulic timing and the emergency stop relay well enough to change behavior without leaving visible damage during routine morning maintenance checks before inspectors arrived late that day, eventually. That morning, Ronald ordered a live demonstration to prove the guards were unnecessary to visiting managers. The hydraulic press handled thick steel panels and cycled with enough force to shear bone. OSHA warnings were pending, and a cold rain had slowed deliveries, increasing pressure to appear compliant. Evan was instructed to operate the controls while Ronald positioned himself beside the die. No lockout procedures were followed. Several workers expressed concern but were told to watch quietly and learn. Training cameras were already running overhead for documentation and insurance purposes that same morning. When the cycle began, the press dropped with more speed than anyone expected. The ram descended as Ronald leaned in mid-sentence, his right arm extended inside the operating space to demonstrate clearance. Evan pressed the activation pedal. The safety light remained green. There was no pause. The steel die closed around flesh. Ronald's arm was dragged inward up to the shoulder in a fraction of a second. The sound was sharp and unmistakable. Bone cracking under hydraulic force. The muscle collapsed and tore as the press continued its stroke without resistance. Blood struck the clear shield and sprayed outward, then poured straight down, spreading rapidly beneath the machine. Ronald staggered once, knees buckling, his face draining of color. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He stayed upright only long enough for the next cycle to begin. 2 operators slammed the emergency stop again and again. The press did not stop. Each cycle drove the crushed arm tighter, forcing blood out in thick pulses onto the floor. Ronald collapsed sideways against the frame, consciousness fading as shock set in. When the power was finally cut, his arm was no longer intact, and the bleeding had already overwhelmed his circulation. The training camera recorded everything without interruption: the descent, the compression, the repeated cycles, and the moment Ronald stopped moving. By the time the machine went silent, his body lay still beneath it. Blood pooled wide across the concrete, internal failure already irreversible before anyone could reach him. The coroner reported massive crush trauma to the right arm, complete bone fragmentation, and catastrophic blood loss. Internal organs showed a shock response. Death occurred within minutes despite intervention. Machine logs confirmed the emergency stop relay had been deliberately bypassed, preventing it from interrupting the cycle. The injury was immediately unsurvivable without rapid surgical control. Autopsy photographs documented tissue destruction consistent with hydraulic force, and no evidence of defensive movement after initial compression occurred inside the press. The plant was shut down permanently within 48 hours. OSHA cited multiple violations tied to prior complaints. Workers were laid off without severance. Ronald's management bonuses were revoked posthumously, and the company dissolved its regional operations by year's end under mounting legal pressure. Evan Brooks remained on site and was interviewed along with other employees. He was arrested 3 months later after forensic electrical analysis identified unauthorized jumper wiring inside the press control system. He was charged with aggravated murder and workplace sabotage, convicted in 2017, and sentenced to 30 years to life in prison. The training footage remains in use nationwide as a fatal retaliation case study. It was July 19, 2016, and the high desert west toward Kingman baked under a blazing afternoon sun. Interstate 40 shimmered with heat waves as traffic moved steadily across the open stretch. The temperature had climbed to 98 degrees, and most drivers kept their windows up, relying on air conditioning to battle the heat. Merrick Vane, a 47-year-old trucking company owner, had built his business from nothing over 2 decades. Known for his demanding management style, he ran a tight operation that prioritized schedules over comfort. His drivers often complained about the grueling routes he assigned, but Merrick believed that success required sacrifice. Tony Carlisle, 34, had worked as a driver for Merrick's company until 3 weeks earlier. The breaking point had come during a heated confrontation in Merrick's office. Tony had completed an 18-hour haul and was being ordered to immediately take another long-distance route without the federally mandated rest period. When Tony refused, citing safety regulations, Merrick had exploded with anger, calling him weak and unreliable. Merrick threatened to blacklist Tony with other trucking companies. After refusing to complete a 20-hour haul without proper rest, he'd been fired on the spot. The termination had left him bitter and struggling financially. Earlier that morning, Tony had accessed the company lot and tampered with Merrick's pickup truck. He'd jumped the horn relay inside the fuse box, choosing a failure he knew would interfere once the vehicle was already in traffic. The idea was simple in execution, but deliberate in intent. Force Merrick into a moment of helpless exposure behind the wheel. Around 3:30 p.m., Merrick left the depot in his pickup, unaware of the modification. His dashboard camera was recording as usual, a habit he'd developed for insurance purposes. As Merrick merged onto the main highway, he leaned on the horn at a slower vehicle ahead. The horn immediately stuck, producing a continuous ear-piercing blast that couldn't be stopped. The sound was deafening inside the cab, and the relentless noise was overwhelming in the enclosed space, making it difficult to think clearly. What followed was a series of distracted maneuvers that proved fatal. Merrick swerved slightly right toward the shoulder, then overcorrected back toward the travel lane as he fumbled beneath the dashboard, trying to silence the horn while driving. His attention divided between the road and the malfunction. He braked erratically, slowing without signaling. Behind him, a fully loaded semi-truck was being driven by Carl Morton, who was nearing the end of his legal driving window. Fatigued and momentarily distracted, Carl looked up just as Merrick's pickup swerved and braked unpredictably. He slammed on his brakes, but the 80,000-pound vehicle couldn't stop in time. The massive truck struck Merrick's pickup from behind, crumpling the rear end and sending the smaller vehicle spinning across 2 lanes. The pickup careened toward the guardrail. Merrick, who habitually drove without wearing his seatbelt, was violently thrown against the driver's side door as the vehicle rotated. The truck struck the guardrail at an angle, and the impact compressed the driver's side of the cab inward. The steering wheel was driven into Merrick's chest with crushing force. The collision caused severe blunt force trauma to his chest and abdomen, fracturing multiple ribs and causing catastrophic internal injuries. His head struck the door frame repeatedly, resulting in massive skull fractures and brain trauma. Paramedics arrived within 12 minutes, but Merrick was pronounced dead at the scene. The combination of crushing chest injuries, head trauma, and internal hemorrhaging had been immediately fatal. Police investigators traced the horn malfunction back to Tony through security footage and witness statements. When confronted, Tony admitted to sabotaging the vehicle, though he later claimed he had not expected the situation to escalate beyond his control. Dashcam footage confirmed that Merrick's distraction, combined with delayed braking from the fatigued semi-truck driver, triggered the collision. Investigators determined the semi-driver had remained within legal driving limits and was not charged. Tony was charged with involuntary manslaughter and later sentenced to multiple years in state prison. The case closed with prosecutors citing intentional vehicle interference as the initiating cause of death. It was April 16, 2018, just after sunrise, on a remote hiking trail in northern Arizona. The route followed a narrow sandstone ridge miles from the nearest road. Long stretches were exposed with steep drop-offs and no guardrails. Though dry, loose gravel lined the edge and shifted underfoot constantly there. Daniel Mercer was 27 years old. He worked as a junior video editor in Phoenix and spent much of his free time hiking and filming outdoor clips. He wasn't reckless by nature. Friends described him as careful and focused, especially when he had a camera in his hands. He liked documenting moments as they happened. That morning, Daniel was hiking with two longtime friends, Eric Lawson and Tyler Reed, both 28. The plan was simple: walk the ridge, film some scenery, and head back before midday. They carried no climbing gear. It was meant to be a casual hike. As they reached a narrower section of the trail, the drop to the right fell away sharply, broken by rock ledges below. The edge looked solid from a distance, but closer to the rim, the surface changed to loose stone over compacted sand. Daniel stopped several feet back and raised his camera, filming Eric as he stood closer to the edge. Earlier, Eric and Tyler had talked about scaring Daniel to get a reaction on camera. The idea was to fake a near slip, then step back and laugh. Eric wore a heavy backpack and planned to throw it over the edge to sell the moment, then stay where he was. Without warning, Eric shouted and tossed the backpack over the side. The pack disappeared quickly, bouncing off the rock before vanishing. Eric kept his footing and stepped back immediately. Daniel reacted on instinct. The sudden shout and the sight of the falling pack caused Daniel to move forward immediately. He rushed forward, camera still rolling, focused on the edge. He did not stop to check the ground beneath him. His right foot landed on loose gravel near the rim. The stones shifted under his weight. He tried to correct, but his forward momentum carried him past balance. The gravel slid away, and Daniel tipped over the edge. The fall was uncontrolled. He struck the first ledge shoulder first, twisting his body. His head hit next, snapping back. He bounced again, hitting his hip and back, then rolled down a series of sloped rock faces. Each impact slowed him briefly before gravity pulled him farther. The final impact came when his head struck a larger rock outcrop near the base of the cliff. His body slid a short distance and came to rest against broken stone. The camera fell from his hand and landed nearby, still recording. Daniel did not move. Eric and Tyler reached the edge moments later. The terrain below was too steep and unstable for a safe descent. They contacted emergency services and waited at the trail. Rescue teams arrived hours later after hiking in with ropes and technical gear. The terrain slowed access. When responders reached Daniel, he was already dead. His body was secured and lifted out as daylight faded. An autopsy confirmed the cause of death as severe blunt force head trauma. Multiple skull fractures and internal injuries were consistent with repeated impacts during the fall. Investigators ruled the death accidental, noting that the fall occurred after a sudden movement toward the edge and loss of footing on unstable ground. Eric and Tyler turned over their phones and the camera. The footage showed the exact sequence: the thrown backpack, Daniel's forward movement, the slip, and the fall. Authorities found no evidence that Daniel intended to approach the edge closely or take a known risk. No charges were filed. The trail remained open. No barriers were added. The recording was never released publicly. Investigators described the footage as showing how a brief staged scare led to sudden movement near the edge and a fatal loss of footing. It was August 15, 2016, at an auto repair garage in Phoenix, Arizona. By late afternoon, the shop had emptied, leaving only residual heat trapped inside the concrete workspace. Kyle Ramirez was 22 years old and had been working at the garage for just under a year. He handled basic detailing and cleanup tasks and was still learning the workflow of the body shop. Co-workers described him as quiet and cooperative, someone who avoided conflict and usually went along with suggestions from others. He rarely stayed late after shifts and did not socialize much with the rest of the crew. That Tuesday afternoon, Carlos Mendez approached Kyle during lunch. Carlos was in his early 20s and worked in the body shop section. He was known for filming short videos at work and posting them online, often experimenting with materials around the garage for attention. Carlos showed Kyle a short video of a white facial mask being peeled away in one piece to reveal smooth skin underneath. Carlos framed the idea as a harmless prank video. He told Kyle it would make a good birthday surprise video for someone Kyle had recently begun dating. Carlos claimed the product had been purchased online for $40 and insisted it was safe, describing it as similar to peel-off cosmetic masks sold in stores. Kyle was hesitant and said he wasn't interested in social media trends, but Carlos continued to downplay the risk and emphasized how simple it would be. After repeated reassurance, Kyle agreed to stay after closing. At 6 p.m., once the garage was empty, Carlos set up his phone on a tripod several feet away. Kyle tied a red bandana around his eyes and sat in a metal folding chair near the work area. Carlos brought out a small plastic container filled with a thick white paste and began applying it directly to Kyle's face. The substance felt cold at first as it was spread across his forehead, cheeks, and chin. Carlos then applied it around Kyle's nose and mouth, leaving only narrow gaps. Within several minutes, the paste began to warm and thicken. Kyle noticed it was becoming harder to breathe through his nose as the material stiffened and narrowed the openings. When he tried to breathe through his mouth, the paste had already started curing there as well, tightening across his lips and jaw. His breathing became shallow and strained. Carlos continued filming as Kyle stood up and tried pulling at the hardened material. His fingernails slid across the smooth surface without finding an edge. The compound had cured into overlapping layers that pressed tightly against his nose and mouth, severely restricting airflow. Kyle stumbled backward, knocking over a nearby toolbox and scattering tools across the floor. As Kyle's movements became uncoordinated, Carlos finally moved closer and attempted to peel the material away. The hardened shell cracked unevenly and resisted separation. The compound had cured faster than expected, forming a rigid seal that could not be removed by hand. Kyle collapsed to his knees as his breathing slowed and became irregular. Emergency services were contacted after several failed attempts to break the mask apart. Paramedics arrived approximately 12 minutes later and found Kyle unresponsive. He was transported to the hospital where the mask was fully removed. Imaging later confirmed severe hypoxic brain injury caused by prolonged oxygen deprivation. Kyle died 3 days later without regaining consciousness. It was September 14, 2017, at a community center in Fresno, California. The evening shift had just begun, leaving the building mostly empty except for a few staff members finishing their daily tasks. Linda Patterson was 47 and worked part-time as a receptionist at the Riverside Community Center. Divorced and living alone, she kept a quiet routine centered around work. She managed high blood pressure and mild asthma, which made exertion difficult and heightened her anxiety during emergencies. Visitors generally knew her as kind and reliable, though some younger gym members dismissed her or made quiet remarks about her appearance. The center was an aging building with frequent repairs, and Linda was familiar with its safety restrictions. Naturally cautious and rule-oriented, she tended to trust urgent warnings from people she believed knew the building well. That Thursday evening, Linda was working the front desk alone when 22-year-old Derek Stone approached her. A regular gym patron, Derek had mocked her to friends for weeks and had overheard her mention a fear of fires. Hoping to film a panicked reaction for social media, he chose the evening shift because Linda was usually alone and had already noticed ongoing construction he could exploit for the prank. The stairwell had been closed for weeks due to ongoing repairs. Bright orange barricades, caution tape, and multiple warning signs blocked the entrance, indicating that the area was restricted and unsafe due to construction. Derek, determined to make his prank more dramatic, moved the barricade aside and cut through the caution tape earlier that day, creating a narrow opening just large enough for someone to pass through. He knew the area was off limits and that the drop was dangerous, but assumed Linda would stop before anything serious happened. Derek told Linda there was a strong smell of gas coming from the main building and that she needed to evacuate immediately through the back emergency exit. He claimed the front doors had been sealed by the fire department and that everyone else had already left through the rear of the building. Derek spoke with urgency and authority, making Linda believe there was a real emergency. He even held his shirt over his nose to make the gas leak seem more convincing. Linda trusted Derek's warning and quickly gathered her purse and keys. Derek led her toward the back of the building, directing her to the barricaded stairwell. The warning signs and tape were still visible, but in her panic, Linda followed Derek through the opening he had created. Derek watched as Linda hurried into the dimly lit stairwell, then stepped back to film her reaction. Linda rushed down the stairs, believing she was escaping a gas leak. Her breathing was already labored from her asthma and the stress of the situation. As she reached the landing, she stepped onto a section of unfinished flooring that had been temporarily covered with plywood. The board shifted under her weight and gave way, sending her falling 12 feet onto the concrete below. The impact was severe, and Linda's screams echoed through the empty building. A maintenance worker in the parking lot heard the crash and rushed inside to find Linda unconscious at the bottom of the construction area. Derek had fled immediately after realizing what happened. Linda died from internal injuries and rapid blood loss caused by the fall before emergency services could arrive. The coroner's report listed the cause of death as blunt force trauma to the chest and abdomen, with rapid hemorrhage as the primary fatal event. Police reviewed security footage and quickly identified Derek as the person who had tampered with the barricades and led Linda into the restricted area. He was arrested and charged with involuntary manslaughter, reckless endangerment, and criminal trespass. Derek pleaded guilty to all charges and was sentenced to 5 years in state prison. The case was officially closed after the sentencing, with the community center implementing stricter safety protocols and staff training to prevent similar incidents in the future. In Fresno, a fake emergency became a real tragedy. It was March 7, 2018, in a 12-story office tower in downtown St. Louis, where late-evening maintenance work was being conducted during a scheduled power system test. The building's emergency lighting cast dim shadows through the corridors, and most tenants had left hours earlier. 2 emergency stairwells provided the primary evacuation routes, with Stairwell A typically remaining unlocked during maintenance operations, while Stairwell B was under a temporary security override. Selma Jory, a 51-year-old facilities supervisor, was conducting her final inspection of the day before the building's weekend closure. She was a veteran employee nearing retirement, known for her thorough approach to safety protocols and her dedication to maintaining building standards. Her colleagues described her as meticulous and professional. Mark Ellison, a 45-year-old maintenance contractor, had been working in the building for several years and was familiar with the emergency door systems. The magnetic door locks could be controlled remotely from the main security panel. 2 weeks earlier, Jory had hired Ellison for kitchen renovation work through his side handyman business. The results were substandard: crooked cabinets, faulty electrical work, and water damage. When Ellison refused refunds or repairs, Jory posted scathing reviews on Yelp, Google, and Facebook with photos of the shoddy work. Other customers came forward with similar complaints, and Ellison's side business collapsed overnight. Text messages from his phone showed growing anger, including threats to teach her a lesson. That evening, Jory was wearing a body-mounted safety camera, as required by building policy during solo inspections. An unrelated electrical fault within the building's ventilation control system had begun generating smoke that migrated upward through the stairwell shafts, though this was not immediately apparent. As Jory entered Stairwell B to inspect the emergency lighting, Ellison activated the magnetic door override from the security panel. Because the building was undergoing a scheduled power system test, standard fire release interlocks for Stairwell B were temporarily offline, leaving the magnetic lock engaged despite the smoke. He later admitted to investigators that he intended to trap her temporarily as payback for the online reviews, believing she would eventually be found when security made their rounds. The electrical fault suddenly worsened, filling Stairwell B with thick smoke. Jory attempted to force the sealed door, but could not overcome the magnetic locking mechanism. The body camera recorded her increasingly desperate attempts to escape as smoke continued to accumulate. The concrete stairwell acted as a chimney, concentrating the smoke and reducing visibility to near zero. Jory lost her footing on the steps and fell down multiple concrete risers, striking her head and back against the hard surfaces. The body camera continued recording until the battery failed. Building security discovered the electrical fault during a routine sweep and initiated emergency ventilation procedures. Jory was found unconscious in stairwell B when responders forced the door open. She was pronounced dead at the scene from a combination of smoke inhalation and traumatic injuries sustained during the fall. Security system logs showed that the magnetic door lock had been activated from the main panel during the time frame when Jory was conducting her inspection. Ellison initially denied involvement, but later admitted to sealing the door, claiming he was unaware of the electrical fault and insisting he only meant to scare her. Investigators determined that while Ellison could not have anticipated the electrical malfunction, his deliberate action of confining Jory in the stairwell as retaliation for a personal grievance directly contributed to her death. Mark Ellison was charged with first-degree involuntary manslaughter. After a 3-week trial, he was found guilty and sentenced to 12 years in state prison. During sentencing, the judge noted that Ellison's vindictiveness over negative online reviews had cost Selma Jory her life and devastated her family. Ellison showed minimal remorse during the proceedings, maintaining that he never intended for anyone to get hurt. The Jory family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against both Ellison and the building management company that settled for an undisclosed sum before trial. It was October 19, 2015, on a desert trail in Arizona, where rugged terrain, loose gravel, and steep paths ran beside dangerous 30 to 50-foot drop-offs into sandy ravines. Daniel Culp, a 41-year-old insurance adjuster, had been looking forward to this group ATV ride for several weeks as a way to unwind from recent stress in his personal life. Known among friends for his cautious approach to outdoor activities and methodical attention to safety details, he had participated in similar rides throughout the region for nearly 5 years. That afternoon, Daniel had joined a group of 8 riders for what was planned as a routine 3-hour excursion through the established trail network. The group included Trevor Holt, a 36-year-old construction foreman who had been avoiding Daniel for the past month following a contentious custody hearing. Daniel had provided testimony that contradicted Trevor's claims about his work schedule and availability for parenting responsibilities. The custody case had resulted in Trevor losing significant visitation time with his children, and he blamed Daniel's testimony for influencing the court's decision. Over the previous weeks, Trevor had sent several threatening messages to Daniel through social media, suggesting that there would be consequences for his interference in family matters. Trevor had arrived at the staging area early and positioned himself near the parked ATVs while other riders were completing their safety briefings. He had noticed that Daniel's vehicle was parked at the end of the row, somewhat isolated from the others, and he saw an opportunity to create a mechanical problem that would ruin Daniel's day without causing serious harm. The helmet-mounted camera captured the sequence of events that followed. Trevor approached Daniel's ATV and quietly removed the cotter pin securing the rear axle nut, then used a wrench from his toolkit to loosen the nut by several turns, leaving it tight enough to appear secure during a casual inspection, but loose enough to work free under the stress of trail riding. The group began their excursion with Daniel positioned at the rear of the formation, as was his usual preference for filming the other riders ahead of him. For the first hour, the loosened axle nut held in place as the group navigated relatively flat sections of the trail. However, as they approached a steep incline known for its challenging terrain, the mechanical stress began to take its toll. The helmet camera recorded the moment when Daniel's rear axle assembly began to fail while climbing a rocky slope approximately 40 feet above a sandy ravine. The loosened nut had worked completely free, causing the rear hub to slip off the axle splines and creating immediate instability in the vehicle's handling. Daniel attempted to maintain control as the ATV began to tip sideways, but the steep angle made recovery impossible. The vehicle rolled twice before coming to rest upside down in the ravine below, with Daniel trapped underneath the 450-pound frame. The impact had caused severe crushing injuries to his chest and abdomen, and the remote location made immediate rescue efforts extremely difficult. Other riders in the group called for emergency assistance, but the nearest medical facility was more than 45 minutes away. Emergency medical personnel reached the accident site approximately 1 hour after the initial call, but Daniel was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner determined that the cause of death was massive internal trauma consistent with being crushed by heavy machinery. The separated rear axle and loosened nut were recovered from the trail, providing clear evidence of mechanical tampering. The investigation revealed that Trevor had deliberately sabotaged Daniel's ATV, and the helmet camera footage clearly showed his actions at the staging area before the ride began. Phone records confirmed the threatening messages he had sent in the weeks leading up to the incident, establishing a clear motive for the attack. Trevor was subsequently charged with second-degree murder as investigators determined that his actions demonstrated a reckless disregard for human life. The trail system implemented new safety protocols requiring mandatory mechanical inspections before group rides. It was April 22, 2018, inside a commercial climbing gym in Boulder, Colorado. The afternoon was quiet and routine. Music played softly. Chalk dust settled on the mats. Staff rotated stations. Climbers followed their usual patterns. Safety procedures were treated as standard, familiar, and unquestioned. Mark Jensen was 35, a freelance graphic designer who took contract work from outdoor brands and tech startups. He climbed to decompress after deadlines and treated the gym like a workspace where speed mattered. He was skilled, demanding, and openly dismissive of safety reminders, correcting staff loudly and publicly. Regulars recognized him immediately and kept their distance. Tyler Reed was 23. A college student working floor shifts between classes. He handled harness checks and ropes and absorbed Mark's insults without responding. Mark mocked his training, questioned his competence, and once recorded him during a correction. Management warned Mark twice, but prioritized his membership. Tyler stayed for tuition money, logging hours carefully and saying nothing. That Sunday afternoon, Mark arrived, insisting on a fast lead climb despite reduced staffing. A route had been reset overnight and was longer and steeper than usual. A posted notice required assisted belays only. Tyler volunteered to belay. Gym cameras later showed him threading the assisted braking device correctly, then deliberately holding the cam disengaged before clipping it to his harness. Mark ignored the posted notice, clipped in, and stepped onto the wall without a partner check. From the floor, nothing looked wrong. The belay device sat in place, and the rope fed cleanly as if properly set. Music continued playing overhead. Chalk hung in the air as Tyler paid rope out smoothly, his hands steady, his stance squared. Nearby climbers glanced over, saw nothing alarming, and went back to their routes. About halfway up, Mark rushed a sequence, skipping a foothold to save time. His shoes skidded on polished holds worn smooth by years of use. He laughed, shook it off, and kept moving, climbing higher until he was nearly 40 feet above the mat. Below him, Tyler shifted his feet and leaned back slightly, but the rope never caught. A few climbers stopped and watched, sensing something off in the silence. No one spoke, no alarm sounded. Mark's right foot suddenly blew off the hold. His body swung away from the wall. There was no resistance, no tightening the rope. He dropped straight down, accelerating fast enough that the air tore past him. His shoulders slammed into the wall first, snapping his body sideways. He struck again, lower, spinning, his helmet cracking sharply against the surface. He hit the mat hard, folding forward at the waist, legs still lifted as his spine bent far past its limit. The impact forced all the air from his lungs in a single violent burst. His body went still immediately. Tyler never applied tension to the brake strand. As Mark hit the mat, the rope followed a second later, sliding freely through the device and pooling beside him. Dark blood began to spread across Mark's shirt. His face flushed, then quickly turned dusky. A front desk employee hit the emergency button at 2:41 p.m. Emergency services were contacted immediately. Paramedics arrived 7 minutes later and pronounced Mark dead at the scene. Surveillance footage showed the belay device threaded correctly, with the cam deliberately prevented from engaging. Investigators confirmed the route height, fall distance, and mat placement. The equipment functioned as designed, and the failure was determined to be intentional. The coroner determined Mark died within seconds. The fall ruptured his liver and spleen, causing massive internal bleeding. His spine sustained fatal flexion injuries. There was no chance of resuscitation. The cause of death was blunt force trauma from an uncontrolled fall. The gym closed for 3 days. Tyler confessed after reenactment tests proved the belay could not fail accidentally. He was charged with second-degree murder and sentenced to 30 years in Colorado State Prison. Mark's client deadlines went unanswered, and the death was recorded as a workplace homicide in Boulder County court records. Mark fell because someone below him decided the rules no longer applied. The next death didn't happen on solid ground. It unfolded underwater, where trust between two people became the difference between survival and a fatal mistake. It was December 30th, 2016, in New Orleans, Louisiana, as the city slipped into the final nights before New Year's Eve. Music spilled from venues across the Arts District, and one compact nightclub was operating well beyond its intended limits. The building was old, retrofitted piecemeal over decades, with narrow corridors, minimal ventilation, and interior modifications made to prioritize atmosphere over safety. The promoter overseeing the event was Zadie Klump, 38, a fixture in the local music scene known for packing popular acts into undersized spaces. Publicly, she was all efficiency and confidence. Privately, she maintained close, often blurred personal relationships with the people who worked for her, keeping loyalty through promises she rarely intended to keep. That night's event was sold out, with staff instructed to keep auxiliary rooms closed to the public to preserve the main floor's flow. One of those rooms was a small backstage office Zadie regularly used during shows, a converted storage space with foam-lined walls, a single inward opening door, and no exterior ventilation. It was never intended for prolonged occupancy, but it had become her habitual retreat during performances. 3 months earlier, Brandon Cabello, 29, had worked sound for the same venue. His relationship with Zadie had extended beyond work, built on late nights, private reassurances, and repeated promises that he had a future with her and the business. When he began raising concerns about blocked exits, overloaded circuits, and flammable materials, her tone changed. She dismissed him as unstable, cut him off professionally, and quietly ensured he would not be hired elsewhere. Brandon's career and the relationship he believed in ended almost overnight. He did not report her. Instead, Brandon studied the building. He learned how smoke behaved inside older clubs, how quickly foam-lined rooms filled with toxic gases, and how long it took before anyone recognized a problem beyond the stage lights. He focused on the backstage office Zadie used every show, the one place she would be alone while the crowd remained distracted. Earlier that afternoon, Brandon accessed the building under the pretense of retrieving old equipment. He placed additional storage cases against the backstage office door, reducing its swing and partially obstructing the exit. Inside the room, he concealed a timed electrical heat source near the foam-lined wall, designed to activate later and produce thick, toxic smoke without drawing attention beforehand. The setup would not draw immediate attention from the main floor. He left the building before doors opened. As the headlining act began their set, the club filled with sound and movement. Zadie retreated to the backstage office as she often did, closing the door behind her to escape the noise. From inside, the music became a dull vibration. Moments later, the concealed ignition began to burn. The foam-lined walls produced dense black smoke almost immediately. The confined space trapped heat and toxic fumes, filling the room from the ceiling down. Zadie coughed and moved toward the door, but the added obstruction made it difficult to open fully. Smoke stung her eyes and burned her throat as she struggled to breathe. The club outside continued uninterrupted. Within minutes, the air inside the office became unbreathable. The burning foam released chemical-laden smoke that rapidly deprived her body of oxygen. Zadie collapsed near the door, disoriented and gasping, unable to clear the space before losing consciousness. It was only when smoke began seeping into a service hallway that staff realized something was wrong. By the time the door was forced open, the office was filled with thick smoke and extreme heat. Emergency responders arrived shortly after and pronounced Zadie dead at the scene. The medical examiner ruled the cause as acute smoke inhalation from toxic combustion byproducts. Investigators determined the ignition had been deliberate. Surveillance footage and access records identified Brandon Cabello, who initially denied involvement and claimed he had been retrieving equipment earlier that day. Months later, confronted with mounting forensic evidence and access logs, Brandon admitted to setting the fire and acknowledged that he knew the office's conditions made survival unlikely. Prosecutors concluded the act was targeted and intentional. Brandon Cabello was charged with second-degree murder and, in 2018, was convicted and sentenced to 25 years to life in state prison. The nightclub was permanently closed following the investigation. It was April 18, 2018, in a small college town in the Midwest just after sunset. Classes were winding down for the semester. Students moved between houses and restaurants, celebrating birthdays and the end of exams. Nothing about the evening stood out. The birthday was for Ethan Morales, 21 years old, a junior majoring in communications. He worked part-time at an electronics store and talked about getting into media work after graduation. Friends described him as easygoing and trusting. He usually went along with ideas instead of planning them. The group met at an off-campus house after dinner. Music played. Phones were out. Someone suggested copying prank videos they had seen online. Fake kidnappings meant to scare someone briefly, then reveal the joke. In the videos, nothing went wrong. They agreed it would last less than a minute. Ethan was chosen because it was his birthday and because he trusted everyone there. The car belonged to one of the friends, an older four-door sedan that had changed hands among students. The trunk latch had a history of sticking and sometimes needed multiple pulls to open. The car did not have an internal trunk release. Everyone knew the latch was unreliable, but no one checked it. Just before 8:30 p.m., Ethan stepped outside with two friends, laughing at something on his phone. The others followed. When they grabbed him, he laughed and resisted lightly, assuming it was part of the joke. Someone filmed from nearby. They lifted him into the trunk feet first. He was still laughing when the lid came down. The trunk closed harder than expected. Inside the latch, the mechanism jammed. No one noticed. The group got into the car and started driving, planning to stop briefly at another house before ending the prank. Music was playing, and the windows were up. Inside the trunk, the space was dark and cramped. Airflow was limited. As Ethan's breathing sped up from panic, carbon dioxide built up quickly, making each breath less effective. The metal enclosure trapped heat, raising his body temperature. He began yelling and pounding on the lid. The sound did not carry into the car. As minutes passed, his movements weakened. Panic and rapid breathing made the air worse faster. Heat stress set in. His coordination failed. He clawed at the inside of the trunk near the latch, leaving scratch marks and tearing the lining. Nearly an hour passed while the car remained parked and the group stayed inside, distracted and unaware of what was happening in the trunk. When they finally returned to the car, the noise from the trunk had stopped. Someone commented that it didn't sound funny anymore. They pulled over and rushed to the trunk. The latch stuck again. After repeated attempts, it finally opened. A rush of trapped hot air came out. Ethan was curled on his side, soaked in sweat. His lips were bluish. He did not respond. They pulled him out and began CPR, while emergency services were contacted. Paramedics arrived and took over care, but it did not help. Ethan was pronounced dead at the scene. The autopsy determined the cause of death was hyperthermia, with associated hypoxia due to trunk confinement. The medical examiner noted a dangerously high core body temperature, fluid in the lungs, and signs of acute respiratory distress. The scratch marks and nail damage inside the trunk confirmed he had been conscious and trying to escape. The death was ruled accidental. No one was charged with homicide. Investigators found no intent to harm. The car was seized, and photos of the trunk were included in the final report to show how quickly conditions could become fatal. Friends later gave statements. Several said the same thing. They thought it would be funny. They thought they had time, and they believed someone would notice if it went wrong. The car was later scrapped. It never returned to the road. Investigators described it as a physical reminder of how quickly a prank can become lethal, not through violence, but through heat and minutes that no one was counting. Ethan Morales trusted the people around him and assumed there was time to react. It was November 12, 2015, inside a downtown office complex in Cleveland, Ohio. After business hours, the building was largely empty, with only security patrols and overnight cleaning staff moving through its quiet hallways. Kieran Moss, a 24-year-old janitor, was working his usual night shift at the Meridian office complex. He had been doing this job for 6 months to pay off his student loans while studying accounting through online courses. Kieran was quiet and kept to himself. He sent most of his paycheck to his sick mother in Korea. Kieran had no friends at work and rarely spoke to anyone during his shift. He ate his dinner alone in the break room and listened to accounting lectures on his phone while he cleaned. The other employees barely noticed him moving through the building each night. Kieran had been working overtime shifts whenever possible, sometimes staying until 8 a.m. to clean additional floors. He was saving every dollar to bring his sick mother from Korea to the United States for medical treatment. That Thursday evening, 2 security guards decided to play a prank on Kieran. Blaze Cortez and Ryder Stone were both in their 30s and had worked building security for several years. They had been watching Kieran's routine for weeks and knew he always took the elevator to the 8th floor around 10 p.m. to clean the executive offices. Blaze proposed jamming the elevator between floors and leaving Kieran trapped temporarily as a joke. Ryder agreed, saying it would be funny to see how Kieran would react to being trapped. They planned to use the emergency override panel to stop the elevator between the 8th and 9th floors, then come back later to rescue him and act like heroes. The building's elevator system was an older model with outdated safety protocols. Maintenance records later showed several top-of-car safety interlocks had been disabled during prior servicing and never restored. At 10:15 p.m., Kieran entered the elevator with his cleaning cart as usual. The guards waited until the elevator reached the 8th floor, then used their override access to stop it between floors. The elevator car was now suspended about 4 feet below the 9th floor landing. Kieran pressed the emergency button and called out, but the guards had turned off their radios temporarily. He did not know the elevator stoppage was intentional and assumed it was a mechanical failure. After 20 minutes of being stuck, believing it was the only way out, Kieran decided to try climbing through the ceiling hatch. The guards heard noise from the elevator shaft, but continued watching on security monitors. Kieran managed to open the ceiling hatch and pull himself up onto the top of the elevator car. The shaft was dark, and he could barely see the cables and machinery above him. He tried to climb toward the 9th floor opening to get help. While Kieran was on top of the elevator car, Blaze used the override panel to restart the elevator, knowing Kieran had exited the car but failing to verify his position before reactivating the system. Blaze activated the elevator without checking if anyone was on top of the car. The elevator resumed normal programmed movement toward the 9th floor. Kieran was caught between the rising elevator car and the concrete ceiling of the shaft. The car continued its programmed movement, crushing him in the narrow space above. The elevator stopped automatically when it reached the 9th floor, but Kieran was trapped in the narrowing space between the elevator car and the concrete ceiling of the shaft. The guards heard a loud crash and realized something had gone wrong. They rushed to the elevator and found the car had reached the 9th floor normally, but Kieran was not inside. Ryder discovered Kieran's body crushed above the elevator car. Blaze called for emergency help while claiming they had found the elevator malfunctioning. It took rescue workers 30 minutes to lower the elevator car and extract Kieran's body. He had died from crushing injuries to his chest and head. Building maintenance records showed the elevator had been functioning normally before the guards' intervention. Security footage revealed their use of the override system and the restart command that caused Kieran's death. Both guards were charged with involuntary manslaughter. Blaze Cortez received an 8-year prison sentence for reactivating the elevator without verifying Kieran's position. Ryder Stone received 5 years as an accomplice. Building management later faced regulatory penalties and civil action for allowing security personnel unsupervised access to elevator controls. It was July 4th, 2016, at an abandoned construction site outside Las Vegas, Nevada. Extreme heat baked the empty site, where only a small cleanup crew was working the holiday shift. Miguel Santos was 34 years old and worked short-term construction jobs wherever labor was available. He shared an apartment with several other workers and sent most of his earnings back to his family. Miguel kept largely to himself and spoke limited English, relying on co-workers to explain tasks and instructions on site. He was known for showing up early, volunteering for extra work, and agreeing quickly when asked for help, even when he did not fully understand the situation. On this job, Miguel was working alongside three younger co-workers who were irritated about being scheduled on the holiday. They had spent the morning moving slowly, complaining about the heat and the lack of supervision at the abandoned site. Over time, they had grown frustrated with Miguel's eagerness to work, often teasing him for being overly serious and not catching on to jokes. That afternoon, the irritation escalated into an idea they framed as a harmless prank. Near the center of the site stood a large, partially completed concrete water tank. The structure was cylindrical, with thick walls, a narrow access opening at the top, and no active ventilation system. The interior had recently been coated with waterproofing sealants, and warning signs posted nearby indicated that the tank was a confined space, requiring air testing and safety equipment before entry. The tank had been sealed off for future work, but the access hatch remained unsecured. The three co-workers told Miguel they wanted to test how sound carried inside the tank, joking that it would echo loudly. They said it was part of a quick safety check and promised him extra cash if he helped for a minute. They assured him they would stay right outside and open the hatch immediately. Miguel hesitated briefly, but agreed, trusting their explanation and assuming it was routine. Miguel climbed into the tank using a temporary ladder. Once he was inside, one of the men pulled the heavy hatch closed, latching it shut as part of the prank. They expected Miguel to shout or bang on the wall so they could laugh and open it again. Instead, the interior air quickly became difficult to breathe. The tank was small, sealed, and still contained concentrated chemical vapors from the sealant application. With no airflow, oxygen levels dropped while fumes accumulated. Within a short time, Miguel's voice weakened. He called out that he felt dizzy and could not breathe properly. At first, the others assumed he was exaggerating, continuing the joke for a few more moments. When Miguel stopped responding altogether, panic set in. They tried to reopen the hatch but struggled with the latch mechanism, which had not been used in weeks and had partially warped in the heat. As they fumbled with the hatch, one of the men ran to find help. A security guard from a nearby commercial building noticed the commotion and called emergency services. By the time the hatch was forced open, Miguel was unconscious inside the tank. First responders arrived minutes later, but were unable to revive him. Miguel was pronounced dead at the scene. The coroner determined the cause of death to be asphyxiation due to oxygen displacement in a confined space, with chemical vapor inhalation as a contributing factor. Investigators confirmed that the tank met the criteria for a hazardous confined space and that proper safety procedures had not been followed. Police arrested all three co-workers. During questioning, they admitted the act was meant as a prank and that they did not believe the tank posed a serious danger. All three were charged with involuntary manslaughter and reckless endangerment. Each later accepted plea agreements and received prison sentences. The construction company responsible for the site was fined for failing to properly secure hazardous areas, and the case was officially closed following sentencing. It was November the 19th, 2017, along a commercial fishing pier on the Oregon coast, where early morning fog hung low over the water, and wind gusts were already reaching 30 miles per hour. The weathered wooden structure extended 200 feet into the harbor, lined with mooring cleats and electrical hookups for the small charter boats that operated from the facility. Storm warnings had been issued for later that day, with conditions expected to deteriorate rapidly as a Pacific front moved inland. Orion Cade, a 42-year-old charter boat captain, had arrived before dawn to prepare his vessel for what would likely be the last fishing trip before the weather turned dangerous. He operated on narrow profit margins, making every available day on the water crucial for his livelihood. Cade was known for his meticulous preparation and conservative approach to safety, traits that had kept him incident-free during 15 years of coastal fishing operations. Cade had recently ended a tumultuous 3-year relationship with Evan Pike, a dock worker in his mid-30s who also kept a small sailboat at the harbor. The breakup had been contentious, with disputes over shared property and accusations of infidelity. Pike had been ordered by the court to stay at least 100 yards away from Cade, following incidents of harassment and threatening phone calls. Pike had violated the restraining order multiple times, showing up at locations where Cade was known to dock and leaving hostile messages on his boat. Text messages recovered later from Pike's phone contained threats about making Cade regret the breakup and references to ensuring he understood the consequences of his actions. That morning, Cade was working alone on his 24-foot fishing boat, preparing nets and checking equipment while the vessel remained tied to the pier. The boat's engine was idling in preparation for departure, with the propeller intermittently engaged as wind and line tension affected the drivetrain. Security cameras mounted on nearby light poles captured Pike moving along the pier structure approximately 30 minutes before the incident occurred. Pike used a utility knife to cut through a secondary tension line that helped stabilize boats during high wind conditions. As the severed line released tension, the boat yawed sharply in the strengthening wind. The sudden lateral movement caused Cade to lose his footing on the wet deck. He stumbled toward the stern as the vessel lurched, unable to regain balance as the hull shifted beneath him. Cade fell overboard near the stern while the engine remained engaged at idle. His legs struck the rotating propeller as he entered the water, causing catastrophic lower limb trauma. Blood spread rapidly across the surface as he was forced briefly against the hull before slipping beneath the water. The boat continued to move erratically in the wind until the engine eventually stalled. Harbor Patrol responded to reports of an unmanned vessel drifting near the pier. Rescue divers recovered Cade's body 22 minutes after the initial emergency call, but he had already succumbed to blood loss and trauma from the propeller strike. The medical examiner determined that the combination of severe laceration and cold water exposure had caused rapid incapacitation. Investigators found the severed tension line and matched tool marks to equipment in Pike's possession. Security footage showed him in the area during the time frame when the sabotage occurred, clearly violating his restraining order. Pike initially denied involvement, but later admitted to cutting the line, claiming he only intended to inconvenience Cade. Phone records and witness statements contradicted Pike's claim. Harbor workers reported seeing Pike watching Cade's morning routine from a distance on previous days. Digital forensics revealed Pike had researched the pier's security camera blind spots in the weeks prior to the incident. Prosecutors argued that Pike's harassment and premeditated actions demonstrated reckless disregard for human life. Pike was charged with second-degree murder, but after plea negotiations, he was convicted of voluntary manslaughter. The court determined that while Pike may not have specifically intended to kill Cade, he had deliberately created a dangerous situation knowing Cade would be aboard the vessel. He was sentenced to 15 years in state prison with eligibility for parole after serving 85% of his sentence. The case prompted new security measures at the harbor and stricter enforcement of restraining orders in maritime settings. It was June 18, 2017, at a municipal skate plaza in Oregon, where a drained 8-foot deep pool with shallow fetid rainwater created a dangerous concrete landing area. Damon Fox, a 41-year-old freelance content creator, had spent 3 years documenting skateboarding accidents for his social media channels. Known for his predatory filming, he had developed a notorious reputation for exploiting embarrassing moments for viral impact. His aggressive pursuit of dramatic footage had earned him over thousands of followers, but widespread contempt within the skating scene. That afternoon, Damon had positioned himself near the pool section with his chest-mounted camera. Among the skaters was Trent Hollis, a 38-year-old maintenance worker who had become the unwilling victim of Damon's most vindictive campaign. Over 5 months, Damon had targeted Trent repeatedly, posting 3 increasingly degrading videos of his falls and mistakes. The most recent, posted 3 weeks earlier, showed Trent lying on the ground in obvious pain while Damon zoomed in on his face and provided sarcastic narration mocking weekend skaters. The video had been viewed over 1,000 times. Trent's employer had seen it. Co-workers ridiculed him relentlessly. He received harassing messages from strangers, and his teenage daughter faced bullying at school because of it. When Trent confronted Damon and begged him to remove the videos, Damon laughed in his face, dismissed his concerns as mere business, then filmed that confrontation too, posting it with a caption suggesting Trent couldn't handle a joke. The humiliation had consumed Trent, costing him sleep and straining his family relationships. He formulated a calculated plan for revenge that mirrored his own experience. Trent knew Damon would position himself at the edge of the drained pool for the best filming angle. His plan was to damage the concrete surface near the edge. He would use his work tools to chip and roughen a specific spot where Damon typically stood, creating an uneven surface that would cause him to slip and fall into the shallow pool below. It would be the same kind of embarrassing fall that Damon had mocked Trent for, captured on Damon's own chest camera. Trent had even brought his phone to film the reaction and posted online with mocking commentary, giving Damon a taste of his own medicine. He intended only a humiliating tumble into the water that would ruin Damon's expensive equipment. The chest-mounted camera captured what followed. When Damon took his usual position at the pool's edge, filming nearby skaters, Trent approached with his heavy work chisel. Earlier that afternoon, during a quieter moment, Trent had already scored and chipped a section of the concrete lip where Damon stood, creating an imperceptible but treacherous uneven surface. As Damon shifted his weight to follow a skater's movement, his foot caught on the damaged section. He lost his balance completely, falling backward into the empty basin and striking his head against the concrete wall before sliding down into the shallow water at the bottom. The impact caused immediate skull fractures, and he lost consciousness instantly, collapsing motionless in the chemically tainted water. Trent stood frozen in horror. Other skaters called emergency services. The chest-mounted camera continued recording, providing clear evidence of the fall. The damaged concrete section was discovered during the investigation. Emergency crews arrived within minutes and rushed Damon to a trauma center, where he was pronounced dead from blunt force head injuries sustained in the 8-foot fall. Investigators determined Trent had deliberately damaged the concrete edge to make Damon slip, finding notes describing the plan and tool marks matching his chisel. He was charged with voluntary manslaughter after prosecutors said the sabotage showed reckless disregard for life. Trent admitted he meant only to humiliate him, never imagining the fall would be fatal. It was May 11, 2015, at Klong Toi Market in Bangkok, Thailand. Heat rose from wet concrete. Vendors shouted prices, sliced fish and stacked greens. Buyers pressed through narrow aisles, bags brushing stalls. Deliveries arrived non-stop. Everything functioned on routine, noise, and speed. Morning traffic hummed nearby under fluorescent lights. One of the vendors was Sam Phan, 48, who had sold vegetables from the same corner stall for almost 20 years. She bought produce from nearby farms, paid her market fees on time, and depended on regular customers like street food cooks and small restaurants. She was direct, protective of her space, and serious about foot traffic. Losing customers meant falling behind on rent. 2 stalls away was May Ratan, 42, newer to the market and loud about selling. She lowered prices by a few baht and openly called out to Sam's regulars as they walked past. What started as complaints turned into daily shouting. Market supervisors told both women to calm down, but never stepped in. That morning, a noodle shop owner glanced at Sam's stall, hesitated, then walked past and bought vegetables from May instead. It wasn't the first time. Vendors nearby heard May call out prices louder than usual, clearly aiming at Sam's regulars. Sam went still, jaw tight, then slammed her metal scale onto the table hard enough to rattle nearby produce. Customers stepped back. She accused May of stealing buyers and undercutting on purpose. May shouted back, saying customers could choose whoever they wanted. The argument grew louder as Sam pushed through the aisle toward the shared wash area behind the stalls. She was no longer trying to sell, only to confront. May followed closely, still yelling, refusing to drop it. Other vendors avoided getting involved, pretending to work. The narrow corridor behind the stalls was wet and cramped, crowded with plastic crates, tangled hoses, and open buckets of cleaning chemicals everyone used, leaving little room to move or calm down. CCTV later showed May reaching for a wide plastic basin filled with a strong cleaning solution meant for scrubbing vegetable boxes. As Sam turned back to face her, the argument escalated. May stepped forward and drove the basin into Sam's upper body. The liquid surged upward, splashing directly into Sam's face, eyes, and chest. The chemical soaked into her skin instantly. Sam screamed and dropped her hands to her eyes, clawing at them as the burning intensified. She stumbled blindly out of the corridor toward the main aisle, knocking into a crate. Her feet slipped on the wet concrete. She fell backward without bracing, her head striking a steel post with a sharp hollow crack that cut through the market noise. Her body went limp on the floor. Vendors nearby froze, stunned by the sound. Others backed away, shouting for help. Market security was called at 8:52 a.m. Paramedics arrived 9 minutes later and found Sam unresponsive. Her face and neck were badly burned, her eyes swollen shut. Her breathing was shallow and irregular. She never regained consciousness and was pronounced dead shortly after arrival at the hospital. The post-mortem found serious chemical burns to her eyes, mouth, and throat. The head injury showed a skull fracture and bleeding inside the brain. The coroner ruled that the chemical splash caused instant disorientation and loss of vision, leading to the fall that killed her within minutes. Afterward, Sam's stall stayed closed. Regular customers left flower garlands on the metal frame. May was arrested after vendors testified and CCTV confirmed the shove. She was charged with assault, resulting in death, and later sentenced to 18 years in prison. Market officials banned strong cleaning chemicals and reassigned stalls. It was August 5th, 2015, at a small freshwater dive site along the eastern shore of Lake Tahoe, California. The afternoon was warm and windless, with clear skies overhead and calm water below. A group of students had gathered at a wooden dock beside a local dive shop for an open water certification session. Tanks, fins, and weight systems were staged neatly along the planks as instructors prepared for a routine training dive. The lead instructor that day was Keller Bantz, 41, a certified diver with more than a decade of teaching experience. Despite his credentials, Bantz was known for rushing safety checks and dismissing concerns raised by students. Complaints had been made before, but none resulted in formal discipline. He continued leading certification dives without oversight. Watching from the dock was Joseph Drum, 46, whose teenage son had nearly drowned during a previous training session 3 weeks earlier. During that dive, Bantz had failed to verify the boy's equipment before descent, leaving him struggling underwater until another student intervened. When Joseph confronted Bantz afterward, the instructor minimized the incident and warned that further complaints could jeopardize the boy's certification. No report was filed, no changes were made. Joseph did not pursue legal action. Instead, he researched diving fatalities and focused on one critical failsafe: ballast release. Without it, a diver who runs low on air cannot surface. At depth, panic accelerates breathing. Air depletes rapidly, and rescue, if it comes at all, often arrives too late. Earlier that morning, while instructors were distracted preparing equipment, Joseph accessed Bantz's gear. He focused on the integrated weight system, deliberately disabling the quick release so it would move but not disengage. The alteration was hidden and would pass a routine visual check. Joseph tested it twice before leaving it in place. He then chose the timing and depth carefully, between 50 and 60 feet, knowing that once Bantz's air supply dropped, the instructor would be unable to surface. Joseph accepted that outcome. The dive began without incident. Bantz descended first, settling near the lake bed to demonstrate buoyancy control. Students followed at a distance, some recording the dive with mounted cameras. The water was cold and clear, the low temperature at depth tightening his muscles and accelerating his breathing. Visibility was excellent. Minutes into the dive, Bantz signaled an ascent drill. He attempted to rise and failed. Assuming a minor buoyancy issue, he fully inflated his buoyancy compensator and kicked harder. He remained pinned low in the water. Bantz reached for his weight release. It did not disengage. He tried again, pulling harder. The handle moved, but the weight stayed locked. His breathing rate spiked under stress and his pressure gauge dropped rapidly as he kicked upward. Students nearby recorded his movements as he signaled distress and attempted to swim free of the ballast holding him down. The effort only worsened the situation. As his air supply dropped, Bantz's movements became erratic. He kicked violently, stirring sediment from the lake bed. His breathing grew rapid and shallow. The buoyancy compensator provided limited lift, nowhere near enough to overcome the trapped weights. When his regulator ran dry, Bantz attempted one final ascent. He rose briefly, then sank back toward the bottom. By the time additional instructors reached him, he was motionless. Bantz was brought to the surface and pulled onto the dock, where emergency responders initiated resuscitation. It failed. The medical examiner later ruled the cause of death as asphyxiation due to drowning. with contributing factors including exhaustion and inability to establish positive buoyancy. Examination of the equipment revealed deliberate obstruction of the weight release mechanism. Investigators reviewed dive footage, dock surveillance, and access logs, identifying Joseph Drum as the only person who had handled Bance's equipment prior to the dive. When first questioned, Drum denied any involvement and claimed he had never touched the weight system. Confronted with video evidence and forensic examination showing deliberate obstruction of the release mechanism, Drum later admitted disabling the weights. He acknowledged understanding the consequences and stated that Bance's death was the result of his own negligence. Prosecutors concluded Drum had intentionally created a lethal underwater condition. He was charged with second-degree murder and, in 2017, convicted and sentenced to 25 years to life in state prison. The dive shop suspended certification training and revised its safety protocols. It was February 6, 2018, just after 10:30 p.m. in a second-floor apartment in Riverside, California. Most of the building was quiet for the night. Lights were off in nearby units, and the parking lot below was mostly empty. Michael Harper was 36 years old. He worked as an operations manager for a regional logistics company. Friends described him as organized and practical, but sometimes unaware of how his jokes landed. He had been married to Emily for 7 years. Their relationship had been strained by work schedules and money concerns, but there was no history of violence, threats, or police involvement. That day was their wedding anniversary. Michael wanted to surprise Emily when she got home from work. Earlier in the evening, he cooked dinner. After preparing the food, he left a chef's knife on the kitchen counter, planning to clean it later. Michael had ordered a cheap wig online days earlier. His idea was to stage a prank that would make Emily think he was in bed with someone else, then reveal it as a joke. He did not discuss the plan with anyone and did not consider how someone might react before understanding what they were seeing. In the bedroom, Michael arranged pillows under the blankets to resemble two people. He placed the wig on one pillow so the hair spilled over the edge. He left the room, lights off. From the doorway, the scene looked convincing. Michael then hid in the bathroom to wait. Emily arrived home shortly after 10:30 p.m. She entered quietly, assuming Michael might already be asleep. The apartment lights were dim. Dinner sat on the stove. She walked toward the bedroom without turning on the hallway light. From the doorway, she saw two shapes under the covers. One was on Michael's side of the bed. The other appeared to have long hair. There was no movement and no explanation. Investigators later stated that Emily's reaction was consistent with an acute stress response, triggered by what she believed she was seeing in the dark. Within seconds, Emily turned and went back to the kitchen. Her movements were automatic and unplanned. The knife Michael had left on the counter was still there. She picked it up and returned to the bedroom without turning on the lights. She did not call out or turn on the light. Michael heard her enter but did not react in time. He was still waiting to reveal the prank. Emily stabbed once through the sheets into Michael's chest. The blade went in deep, passing between the ribs and damaging a major blood vessel near the heart, causing immediate and massive internal bleeding. Michael sat up briefly as the pillows collapsed and the wig fell to the floor, revealing the setup. Blood spread quickly through the sheets. He then lost consciousness and fell backward onto the mattress. Medical examiners later confirmed that the blood loss would have caused him to black out within seconds. Emily realized something was wrong. She dropped the knife and pulled back the bedding, trying to stop the bleeding. The wound could not be controlled. Emergency services were contacted. Paramedics arrived to find Michael unresponsive and without a pulse. Resuscitation efforts were attempted, but were unsuccessful. He was pronounced dead at the apartment. Police documented the staged bed, pillows, and wig. The knife was recovered beside the bed. There were no signs of a struggle beyond the single wound. Neighbors reported no shouting or argument before the incident. An autopsy confirmed the cause of death as a single penetrating chest wound causing rapid hemorrhage. There were no defensive injuries and no other trauma. The medical examiner concluded that death occurred very quickly. The death was ruled a homicide, with investigators identifying the staged prank as the triggering event rather than an act of premeditated violence. There was no evidence of intent to kill and no prior history of violence. Court records noted that the staged prank created a foreseeable risk, while expert testimony explained how sudden shock can override judgment. The case was prosecuted as a homicide without premeditation. Court findings noted the absence of intent and the role of the staged prank in the fatal sequence. The apartment was later re-rented, and the wig and pillows were destroyed after evidence processing. Daniel never saw that his joke would be his last. What followed shows how panic can turn a private space into a crime scene. Cleveland proved that workplace pranks can turn machinery into weapons. But our final story takes us to a backyard pool where the deadliest deception would be the simplest: a lie about what lay beneath the water's surface. It was September 9th, 2017, when evening temperatures in Scottsdale, Arizona reached 84 degrees under clear desert skies. The backyard pool area faced west, allowing the setting sun to reflect off the water's surface at approximately 78 degrees. Sofia Martinez, a 20-year-old waitress, was attending her first house party at the home of wealthy classmate Camilla Stone. Sofia worked part-time and had recently dropped out of community college. She was friendly, but had been focused on work and school. Several people at the party recognized her from her waitressing job and said hello. Sofia had a few close friends from work, though most couldn't make it to the party that night. Sofia had lost 30 pounds over the summer and was trying to reinvent herself with a new social group. She'd been invited by her co-worker Mia, who knew Camilla from high school. Sofia rarely went to parties and was nervous about being around so many popular students. Sofia had been working double shifts at the restaurant for the past month, trying to catch up on overdue bills. Her rent payment was 3 days late, and her landlord had already called twice about the missing money. That Saturday evening, a group of popular girls approached Sofia near the pool. Camilla Stone, Kendall Pierce, and Skylar Quinn were all known for their social media presence and had thousands of followers. They had been drinking and were looking for entertainment. Camilla told Sofia they were playing a game where someone had to retrieve a phone that had been accidentally dropped in the deep end of the pool. She claimed it was an expensive iPhone and offered Sofia $200 to dive down and get it. Sofia wanted to impress the group and needed the money for rent. She did not mention that she was not a strong swimmer and had always been afraid of deep water. The pool was 12 feet deep on that end, with no ladder nearby. Kendall showed Sofia what looked like a phone at the bottom of the pool. The object was clearly visible through the clear water and appeared to be a black iPhone case. Skylar encouraged Sofia, saying it would only take a few seconds to grab it. Sofia agreed to try. She took off her shoes and jumped into the deep end, while the three girls watched and filmed with their phones. The party music was loud, and most other guests were inside the house or on the other side of the yard. Sofia dove down toward the object and grabbed it, quickly realizing it was not a real phone. Someone had attached weights to a fake phone case to make it sink. As she turned to surface, she became disoriented and began to panic. The pool lights made it difficult to see clearly underwater, and Sofia could not tell which direction was up. She began to struggle and swallow water as her swimming skills failed her in the deep end. Camilla, Kendall, and Skylar continued filming, not recognizing that Sofia was in distress until she stopped moving near the bottom of the pool. The party music was too loud for anyone else to hear splashing or calls for help. It took nearly 90 seconds before someone noticed Sofia floating face down in the water and realized something was wrong. By the time other party guests pulled Sofia from the pool and called 911, she had been underwater too long. Paramedics arrived within 8 minutes, but could not revive her. Sofia was pronounced dead from drowning. The fake phone was found clutched in Sofia's hand when her body was recovered. Camilla, Kendall, and Skylar initially denied involvement, but video recovered from their phones documented the prank and Sofia's dive. Police questioned the three girls separately, and they eventually admitted to the prank. The district attorney's office reviewed the case, but ultimately declined to file criminal charges, citing insufficient evidence of intent. Camilla's parents faced a civil lawsuit from Sofia's family for the wrongful death that occurred on their property. It was June 15, 2016, in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Phoenix, Arizona. The evening temperature was still 89 degrees even after sunset, and most residents had their windows closed and air conditioning running to escape the desert heat. Victor Martin was 39 years old, and had been unemployed for 6 months after his accounting firm downsized and eliminated his position. He lived alone in his deceased mother's house, struggling to pay the mortgage with his rapidly dwindling savings account. Victor was known as a friendly neighbor who regularly chatted with others on his street and had maintained several close friendships from his previous job. He spent his time applying for jobs online and meeting friends for coffee to network. Recent break-ins in the neighborhood had made Victor extremely concerned about home security. He had installed a new alarm system, motion sensor lights, and deadbolt locks on all doors. The neighborhood had experienced a series of break-ins over the past few months, which had left many residents on edge. Victor had become increasingly focused on home security, researching different alarm systems and defensive measures. His friends had noticed his growing preoccupation and suggested he try to relax, but Victor was determined to protect his home. His neighbor's son, 24-year-old Jackson, had been watching Victor's security routines for several weeks. Jackson lived next door with his parents and often saw Victor checking his locks and peering through windows at night. Jackson had been drinking more frequently since losing his restaurant job 2 weeks earlier and wanted to take out his frustrations on someone he saw as an easy target. Jackson recruited 2 of his friends, both 22 years old, to help him stage what they believed would be a harmless but realistic home invasion prank meant only to scare Victor. Their plan was to shut off the power to Victor's house by flipping the exterior breaker switch, make noise outside his windows, and then reveal it was all a joke after scaring him sufficiently. They thought Victor's panicked reaction would be entertaining and worth filming for social media. On the evening of June 15th, Jackson and his friends put their plan into action. They located the exterior breaker panel and switched off the main power at approximately 10:30 p.m., plunging the interior into complete darkness. The 3 young men then began making deliberate noise outside Victor's windows while wearing dark clothing and masks to look like real intruders. Victor immediately noticed the power outage and became suspicious when he heard footsteps and voices outside his house. He tried to call 911 on his cell phone, but the device was dead because he had forgotten to charge it earlier that day. The combination of darkness, strange noises, and inability to call for help sent Victor into a state of panic. Believing he was facing a real home invasion, Victor grabbed a baseball bat from his bedroom closet and went to investigate the source of the noise in his backyard. In the darkness of his backyard, Victor confronted Jackson near the back door. Unable to see clearly and believing he was defending his home from a real intruder, Victor swung the baseball bat with full force. Jackson fell backward and struck his head on the concrete patio stones with a sickening crack. Victor's elderly neighbor had been watching the commotion from her bedroom window and witnessed the entire confrontation. She immediately called 911 when she saw Jackson collapse and stop moving. Victor realized what had happened when he turned on his phone's flashlight and saw Jackson's face beneath the mask. Jackson died from severe head trauma caused by the impact with the concrete. Victor was taken into custody for questioning, but was released after police reviewed the evidence and determined he had acted in lawful self-defense during what he reasonably believed was an active home invasion. The county attorney declined to file charges, and investigators concluded that the staged home invasion prank directly created the conditions that led to Jackson's death, despite Victor acting in lawful self-defense. The 2 friends who had helped plan the staged invasion were charged with trespassing and disorderly conduct in connection with the prank. It was June 3rd, 2016, in a sprawling freight yard outside a small Kansas town where the summer heat had already begun settling into the rail steel by mid-morning. The facility stretched across 40 acres of switching tracks and loading platforms, where massive rail cars sat in long rows waiting to be repositioned for the next shipment. Merrick Boyd, a 38-year-old safety coordinator, had driven out early that Friday to conduct his weekly compliance inspection before the weekend audit. Boyd was methodical by nature, a trait developed during his years as an Army logistics specialist before transitioning to civilian railroad work. His job involved enforcing written safety procedures that many longtime workers viewed as unnecessary bureaucracy. He carried a clipboard and digital camera, documenting violations that could result in hefty federal fines. Most employees tolerated his presence, understanding the regulatory necessity, but a few saw him as an outsider, disrupting their established routines. 3 weeks earlier, Boyd had filed a formal report against Caleb Rourke, a 41-year-old veteran equipment operator who had been disabling safety interlocks to speed up switching operations. The violation, cost Rourke his overtime privileges and damaged his informal leadership status among the crew. Text messages recovered later from Rourke's phone contained warnings for Boyd to stay clear of moving equipment, though investigators would determine these were sent after working hours when both men had left the facility. The morning inspection proceeded normally until Boyd reached the eastern section, where two freight cars sat positioned roughly 28 inches apart on parallel tracks. Security cameras captured him walking between the stationary cars, checking brake mechanisms and coupling hardware as required by his checklist. Boyd was foul of the track, positioned within a narrow temporary maintenance spacing used during switching operations, where all equipment movement was required to be locked out. The freight cars themselves were massive steel containers, each weighing over 80 tons when fully loaded with grain shipments destined for coastal ports. Their coupling systems required precise alignment, and the hydraulic brake mechanisms were designed to hold them stationary, even on slight inclines. Boyd had performed this same inspection routine dozens of times without incident, following protocols established after previous accidents at similar facilities across the Midwest. Minutes earlier, a shunting engine remained coupled to the cars and under remote control, with the air brake system fully charged and capable of movement on command. From a remote locomotive control console inside the operations building, Rourke deliberately initiated a brief forward movement command. The rail car lurched forward faster than Rourke had anticipated, closing the gap in under 3 seconds. Boyd was caught chest first between the steel surfaces. Multiple ribs were fractured immediately, puncturing both lungs as the pressure continued. His pelvis and upper thighs were crushed as the weight of the loaded car pressed against him. Blood began pooling beneath the rail before the emergency stop system finally engaged. The security footage would later show his final moments lasted less than 30 seconds from initial impact to complete stillness. Emergency responders arrived within minutes of the automated distress signal, but Boyd was pronounced dead at the scene. Control system logs showed the movement command had been activated during a designated exclusion period when personnel were known to be conducting inspections in that section. Phone records revealed deleted text messages that were later recovered through digital forensics. The investigation would reveal that Boyd had been planning to recommend additional safety measures following the upcoming audit. Rourke admitted to investigators that he believed a brief movement would intimidate Boyd without causing harm. Federal railroad safety officials concluded that the fatal compression would not have occurred without the deliberate activation during the restricted time frame. Rourke was charged with involuntary manslaughter with a retaliatory motive and cited by federal investigators for willful violations of railroad safety regulations tied to the unauthorized equipment movement. It was February 11, 2015, at a remote desert overlook in Nevada, 120 feet above the valley floor, where loose gravel, stone barriers, and winds made the cliff edge dangerous. Lita Jove, a 31-year-old administrative coordinator, had been looking forward to this camping trip for weeks. Known for her optimistic nature and willingness to work through relationship problems, she had been dating Marcos Rell for nearly 2 years. Their relationship had grown increasingly strained over the past several months, with frequent arguments about trust and commitment. Marcos, a 34-year-old warehouse supervisor known for his extreme jealousy and controlling behavior, had chosen this isolated overlook deliberately after seeing the photograph. Their relationship had already been strained by repeated arguments over Marcos's suspicions and Leda's naturally friendly nature, with several past confrontations fueled by his belief that she was hiding something from him. The remote location and dangerous cliff edge were not incidental. He had chosen the overlook because it offered privacy, isolation, and a setting that made confrontation unavoidable. Just after setting up, he received a photograph on his phone that appeared to show Leda with another man in an intimate situation, reinforcing the suspicions that had already fueled months of tension between them. The image showed Leda embracing someone outside a restaurant. The timestamp indicated it had been taken 3 days earlier, when Leda had told Marcos she was working late. The discovery convinced him that his worst suspicions were finally confirmed. Consumed by jealousy and humiliation, he began to think about revenge. When Leda arrived, she immediately sensed the change in Marcos's demeanor. His usual warm greeting was replaced by cold silence and barely contained rage. She attempted to approach him, but he deliberately stepped back toward the knee-height stone border, positioning himself between her and safety. A tourist hiking nearby captured the beginning of their argument on a smartphone camera before putting it away. The brief footage showed Leda and Marcos in heated discussion near the cliff edge, their body language tense and confrontational. Marcos confronted Leda with the photograph, his voice rising as he accused her of infidelity. As their argument escalated, Leda attempted to walk around him to return to their vehicle. Marcos moved to intercept her, grabbing her shoulders and forcing her backward toward the cliff edge. He intended to drive her to the edge and make sure she never left the overlook alive. As he forced her closer to the precipice, Marcos tightened his grip and deliberately shoved her backward toward the stone border. There was no hesitation. With one final push, he sent her over the knee-height barrier and into the open air below. Leda went over the cliff edge, striking several rock outcroppings during her 120-foot descent to the valley floor. The multiple impacts caused severe blunt force trauma to her head and torso, and she was pronounced dead when emergency responders reached her approximately 2 hours later. The investigation revealed that Marcos had chosen the dangerous location with intent to cause a fatal fall, deliberately positioning Leda near the cliff's edge as an act of revenge. Phone records later confirmed that the photograph had been taken 3 days earlier, when Leda had told Marcos she was working late. Investigators determined that she had been seeing another man, a discovery that became the trigger for Marcos's act of revenge. Marcos was charged with second-degree murder after investigators concluded that he had deliberately forced Leda over the cliff edge in a planned act of revenge. The case highlighted how acts of revenge, when driven by jealousy and rage, can become deliberate and irreversible acts of fatal violence. The overlook campsite was placed under temporary closure, and enhanced warning signage and protective fencing were subsequently installed at similar locations. It was September 6, 2016, in a narrow row of concrete townhouses in Quezon City, Philippines. Afternoon heat settled into the walls as electric fans droned behind open windows. Internet cables sagged between floors. Neighbors went about their routines, doors opening and closing, nothing in the street drawing attention or concern. Arnel Cruz was 21, a third-year information technology student at a state university in Quezon City. He lived with his parents and 2 younger siblings in a small apartment and relied on a single home internet line for online lectures, research uploads, and coding assignments. Losing connectivity meant missed deadlines and failed attendance requirements. Arnel kept to himself and avoided confrontation. His shared bedroom doubled as a study space, with a small desk, modem, and laptop he maintained carefully. For months, he noticed his connection slowing at night, but ignored it. When outages began disrupting exams and submissions, he checked the router logs, confirmed constant unauthorized use from next door, and changed the password without telling anyone. Next door lived Joel Manalo, 31, unemployed after being dismissed from a call center for repeated absences. He lived with his mother and spent most of his time gaming online. The internet was not tied to work or school, only uninterrupted gameplay. When the connection failed, Joel confronted Arnel in the hallway that afternoon. CCTV footage later showed Joel shouting while Arnel remained calm, explaining he needed the internet for school. Arnel closed his door. Neighbors heard Joel insult him as he walked away. That humiliation followed Joel through the night. He stayed inside the apartment, drinking steadily, pacing the narrow floor between the sofa and the door, replaying the hallway argument over and over. Neighbors later said they heard movement past midnight. At 10:06 p.m., Arnel returned from a group study session, backpack slung over one shoulder, keys already in hand as he reached his door. The hallway camera showed Joel stepping out as the lock turned. He closed the distance in seconds. There was no warning, no words. The first stab drove into Arnel's upper chest just beneath the collarbone, the force knocking him backward into the concrete wall. His backpack slid off his shoulder as he gasped. Before he could raise his hands, the second strike plunged into his abdomen, tearing through the liver. Blood spilled immediately, dark and fast. Arnel slid down the wall, trying to stay upright. The third thrust cut into the side of his neck. He collapsed fully onto the tiled floor, legs folding beneath him. Blood spread outward, pooling under his torso and streaking toward the door he had almost opened. He tried to crawl, dragging one arm forward, but his movement slowed within seconds. His head dropped, and his body went still as Joel turned and ran. A neighbor across the hall opened her door after hearing the impact and screaming. She immediately retreated and called emergency services. Joel fled down the stairwell, captured clearly on CCTV holding the knife. Police and paramedics arrived shortly after, but Arnell was already unresponsive. The post-mortem examination documented 3 deep stab wounds. One severed a major artery near the shoulder, causing rapid external blood loss. Another perforated the liver, leading to massive internal bleeding. The neck wound damaged the airway. The medical examiner concluded Arnell died within minutes from hemorrhagic shock. CCTV footage from the hallway, stairwell, and ground floor captured the entire sequence of the attack and escape. The knife was recovered the next morning from a drainage canal nearby. Joel Manalo was arrested at his mother's apartment and charged with murder, qualified by treachery. He was convicted in 2018 and sentenced to reclusion perpetua, equivalent to 20 to 40 years imprisonment without parole. It was March 12, 2017, in downtown Des Moines, Iowa, where an unseasonably warm spring afternoon had drawn visitors into the museum district before closing hours. By evening, the building was sealed to the public, its galleries quiet except for a private after-hours donor event. Lights remained on in restricted wings, security staffing was reduced under internal policy, and access was limited to invited guests moving through controlled interior spaces designed for artifact preservation rather than prolonged human presence. The senior curator overseeing the event was Blake Peters, 42, a collections manager who had worked at the museum for more than 20 years. Known internally as meticulous and reserved, Peters had built his career around archival research and provenance verification. The guest receiving exclusive access that night was John Thompson, 61, a wealthy financier and primary donor whose family foundation provided a significant portion of the museum's annual funding. Thompson's name appeared on plaques throughout the building, associated publicly with cultural preservation and historical stewardship. Months earlier, Peters had uncovered archival records while cataloging a newly acquired collection. The documents detailed wartime seizures of cultural property in Europe, including the destruction of a small regional archive during the 1940s. Among the confiscated materials listed were items belonging to Peters's grandparents, whose family collection disappeared during the occupation and was never recovered. Financial records traced several seized items through intermediaries before they entered private collections connected to the Thompson family. Peters submitted the findings internally, expecting a formal review. Instead, legal counsel advised silence. The artifacts were deemed too entangled with donor relations to pursue publicly. Peters was instructed to halt further research and archive the records without disclosure. Thompson's reputation remained untouched, and upcoming acquisitions funded by his foundation moved forward as planned. That afternoon, Peters finalized preparations for a private viewing. One fragile artifact had been staged inside an archival vault beneath the main galleries, a sealed room equipped with an inert gas fire suppression system designed to protect artifacts without water damage. The vault was never intended for human occupancy beyond brief inspections. Entry required senior authorization, and the door locked automatically once closed. During the event, Peters escorted Thompson to the vault under the pretense of an exclusive examination. Access logs later showed Peters had authorized the entry alone, bypassing the standard 2-person requirement under a donor exemption. Once inside, the heavy steel door sealed behind them, and the fire suppression system was deliberately triggered. Peters stepped back into the corridor, leaving Thompson alone inside the chamber. Within seconds, oxygen levels dropped below survivable thresholds as inert gas rapidly displaced breathable air. Thompson would have experienced shortness of breath, dizziness, and confusion as oxygen levels continued to drop. The vault's emergency release system had been intentionally disabled, and mobile signals could not penetrate the reinforced walls. Surveillance cameras did not monitor interior vault conditions. Outside, Peters followed institutional procedure. He logged the viewing time and delayed initiating a check-in, citing standard inspection duration. When junior staff questioned the delay, they deferred to protocol. No alarm sounded, the fire suppression system having been placed in manual override earlier that afternoon. No forced entry was authorized. Inside the vault, Thompson collapsed before reaching the door. By the time staff escalated the delay and initiated emergency override procedures, more than 20 minutes had passed. The vault was breached, and emergency responders arrived shortly after. Resuscitation efforts failed. The medical examiner later ruled the cause of death as hypoxic asphyxiation caused by inert gas displacement from the fire suppression system. No external injuries were present. Toxicology reports were negative. The environment itself had been lethal. Investigators reviewed access logs, environmental controls, and internal communications. Digital records confirmed Peters had remained on site during the entire interval and took no action to intervene. Prosecutors concluded the death resulted from intentional misuse of a hazardous preservation space, carried out under the appearance of routine institutional procedure. Blake Peters was charged with first-degree murder. In 2019, he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The museum permanently revised its archival access policies, installed occupancy sensors in sealed vaults, and eliminated donor-exclusive access to restricted areas. Thanks for watching. Want to watch more? Click on your screen now.